Claudia.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you for joining the first seminar of our Autumn Research Seminar Series. This is a joint initiative by the Zurbarán Center at Durham University and the Artists Iberian and Latin American Visual Culture Group. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor Claudia Hopkins and the director of the Zurbarán Center. First off, I want to thank Dr. Piers Baker-Bates, the chair of artists, for being such a willing and collegial collaborator in putting this series together. We're also very grateful to the Embassy of Spain and the Instituto Cervantes in London and Manchester for their unstinting support of our initiative. The purpose of the seminar series is to provide an open forum for engaging with cutting-edge research and curatorial projects relating to the arts in Spain and America. I'm therefore absolutely thrilled to have with us Charlotte Skene Catling and Adam Lowe from the Madrid-based Factum Foundation for Digital Technology in Conservation. And I had the privilege to visit the Factum Foundation last week. It was a complete revelation in terms of the reproduction and the rematerialization of artifacts that would otherwise be lost. Since its foundation in 2009, Factum has worked on many recording and facsimile projects around the world. And today they will introduce us to a display they curated especially for the new Spanish gallery in Bishop Auckland, which will open its doors tomorrow. They will be discussing this project live from the top floor at the gallery, and the two speakers will be introduced formally by Lindsay Stainton from the new Spanish gallery. Before I hand over, I would like to remind you to type any questions you may have into the chat box, making sure that you add your name. And my co-chair, Piers Baker-Bates, will then field these questions at the end of the talk. Also, this talk will be recorded, so can I please ask you to switch off your camera and your microphones. In order to see this session properly, I also recommend that you switch your view to speaker's view. So there's a little button in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So there you should choose speaker's view instead of gallery view. I'm also now handing over briefly to Ignacio Peiró from the Instituto Cervantes in London, who will greet you. And then Ignacio will hand over to Lindsay Stainton, who will introduce tonight's speakers and start the session. So Ignacio, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hopkins, and ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I was going to say bienvenidos, welcome to yet another installment of this research seminar series, but of course, today's seminar is not yet another installment. It is indeed a very special occasion. First of all, today we are launching the second season, the autumn season of these seminars, which only shows the brilliant idea they have been and the success they have achieved. For this, I want to congratulate Claudia Hopkins, the Zurbarán Center at Durham University, and our Friends of Artists chaired by Piers Baker-Bates. Having attended myself several of these seminars, I am a witness of the extraordinary quality of the scholarship this initiative has contributed to put together. And I am also a witness of the wide audience they have reached. It has taken only one season to turn these seminars into a reference for Spanish, Portuguese, and Ibero-American art lovers all over the British Isles. At the Instituto Cervantes, all our three branches in London, Manchester, and Leeds, we are extremely glad we have supported these seminars since the very beginning. And I want to thank Claudia and Artes for making it so easy to work with them. Starting also this autumn, we will be launching the new Instituto Cervantes Museum Director Lecture as part of this series. These lectures will enable us to take a closer look on how Spain's most important artistic institutions are governed and organized, and their plans for the future, and all this explained by those in charge of implementing those plans. If I am not mistaken, the first of these lectures will take place in early December with Carolina Miguel, the director of the Museo Nacional del Romanticismo, the Museo Romántico until recent times, which is one of Madrid's most peculiar and charming museums. Amigas y amigos, there is, of course, thankfully, much more to celebrate. Tomorrow is the opening of the Spanish Gallery in County Durham, a moment I have to say I myself have waited for since the minute I first heard of this project several years ago, and even more so since I visited the works there in August 2019. I feel very moved and excited to see this vision come true, and really hope that Spanish art with such established presence in County Durham will be of help to attain the goals so worthy of praise that inspired Jonathan Roffer's Auckland project. I am confident I will see Claudia and many others tomorrow, many of you tomorrow. I am also sure my colleagues from the Spanish Embassy, headed by our new ambassador, who is a keen art lover himself, will be delighted to be there on such a beautiful day for all of us. That's all from me. I will leave the floor now to Lindsay, but I do want to say thanks to all our audience today, and in particular our speakers from Factum Foundation and Skene Catling de la Peña, from whom we will learn more about the Spanish Gallery. This new museum, along with the Zurbarán Center, Artes, and so many exhibitions, initiatives, and research projects are contributing to turn these years into a brilliant moment for Spanish art in the UK, and you can count on the Instituto Cervantes and our embassy to support that. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Lindsay, it's over to you now.
Thank you. Hello, we're on the top floor of the Spanish Gallery in Bishop Auckland, County Durham, which will open to visitors for the first time this Friday. And what we wanted to do was to introduce you to one very special, in fact, unique aspect of the Spanish Gallery, which is the installation by Factum Foundation. This was originally the Backhouse Bank, opened in 1870. It's a Flemish Gothic revival building. And Jonathan Ruffer acquired this and the next door building, which was formerly a school, with the express intention of establishing a gallery of Spanish art that would contextualize the Zurbarán series, Jacob and his 12 sons, in Auckland Castle. In February 2019, the work on these two buildings was underway. It was essentially, at that stage, a shell. There was no staircase. And in that month, Jonathan Ruffer, Adam, and I made a rather perilous ascent up ladders on the exterior of the building and came into this attic floor, which, to put it mildly, was a pretty unprepossessing space. Very strange roof lines inside, sort of half collapsed brick walls, uneven floors. I mean, it looked a dump. There's no other word for it, really. And that, I think, both intrigued Adam, but also, I suspect, probably made him slightly anxious. And then a couple of months later, in April, Charlotte, Adam, Jane, and Jonathan Ruffer and myself went to Toledo and to Seville. And it was in those two cities that this project, this installation, really began to take shape, because we went to look at the collections and the artifacts within the collections and came up with a plan. I seem to remember over breakfast one day, really.
Breakfast is where it took its form.
Yeah, absolutely. And that visit, which lasted, I suppose, about 5 days or so, really set the whole thing in motion. So for the next 2 years, Factum started busily working away on the objects and the interiors that you're going to see in just a moment, while at the same time we were working on the Spanish Gallery on the lower floors. And we should also perhaps just point out that then, of course, COVID happened. And this made the project actually, I must say, really quite complicated, because everything had to be done online. For a time, it was impossible for Charlotte or Adam to come here to do very simple pieces of surveying work and so on. But gradually, this became possible, and Charlotte, who is an incredibly distinguished architect, very kindly set her talents to working out how on earth to convert this space into the bones of an interior that would convince people that they were on a visit to Spain. So at this point, I need to hand over to Charlotte and to Adam to go into more detail, and they're going to guide you through each of the 4 rooms in this installation. So we look forward enormously to welcoming you here and giving you a taste of something really very different and we think superb. Thanks.
Well, I think we should wander in, and Charles, I think we should begin by you explaining actually how we set about trying to turn what Lindsay described as a rather chaotic attic of jumbled roof lines into something coherent.
No, Lindsay's description was very good, and it was quite alarming the first time I came up here to find this strange 2,000 rooms crashing into each other, which they were all joined in very unlikely ways above walls that seemed to have no relation to them. So that became the first thing. How do you actually insert a physical immersive experience of Renaissance Spain into a chaotic Gothic revival building in the north of England? You know, it was a very strange proposition and quite challenging. So the first move was to actually rationalize these ceilings through inserting a number of very specific, very Spanish architectural elements, and they were fascinating because they really did capture the fact that Spain at that moment was lived in simultaneously by the Muslims, by the Jews, by the Christians, in La Convivencia, you know, which was actually a fairly harmonious coexistence. So that divided the place into 5 separate rooms, each of them with a very different atmosphere. And I think
yeah, so I mean, basically what we tried to do is to think, how do we get an audience into the mindset of the Golden Age in Spain? And we decided we should begin with 1500, just after the discovery of America. That high point when Charles V was in a way rapidly about to become a universal monarch. I mean, the kingdom went in 1519 almost around the world. And I think the starting point, well, Lindsay introduced it, so before I talk about the objects, the starting point we wanted to do was to see if it was possible without any original objects, because most of the objects we're going to show you now are still in their original settings. So how you can rethink sharing. Downstairs, the amazing collection that Jonathan Raffa has put together with the team. You know, it has a number of paintings by Maino, who's the figure who sort of straddles from Caravaggio into Spain. It's got on loan from the Hispanic Society in America, one of the great Velázquez paintings of Cardinal Pamphili, painted around the same time as the portrait that obsessed Francis Bacon of Innocent X. So in 1650, 1651. And our little spread begins in 1500 and ends in, let's say, 1676 with the El Greco painting, with the 2 paintings by Juan de Valles Leal from L'Hôpital de la Caridad. But our goal was with each of our partner organizations. So over breakfast that Lindsay mentioned, we began to map out a group of things we wanted to try and achieve, where the Spanish Gallery in Bishop Auckland and all of our partner organizations in Spain all benefit in different ways, but in equal ways. And I think
and the public.
And hopefully the public will, but we begin trying to think it's about sharing works of art, it's about introducing new audiences, it's about working with new technologies, it's about revealing things. So the first map, the first object is the map by Juan de la Cosa. And Juan de la Cosa was on the boat with Christopher Columbus when he first went to America. He actually sailed 7 times across the Atlantic and made this map, which has been described as one of the greatest maps in existence, which has in green at the top. Probably it was intended to be on a table. Very few maps have.
And this is north-south.
This is north, this is south. England is here, Spain is here, Africa goes down, and America is over here. Actually looking not too bad considering it was only discovered a few years earlier. The green line here is the Treaty of Tordesillas. And one of the things we've done throughout this exhibition, which we're not going to have time to do now, is to reveal layers of depth that keep getting deeper. So,
I think, yeah, it would be nice to put a wallpaper too, which really sets up some of the ideas that are explored in greater depth as you go through the space. And it also sort of shows how the more you look, the more you can find, and the deeper you can go. So these were based on the hangings in the Sistine Chapel and the amazing wallpaper factories in Madrid. And it's a very interesting sort of layering of photography and elements. Each of these is overlaid with a brush stroke by Velázquez. And this is an extraordinary piece from a sepulchre from the
sepulchre of Doña Catalina Ribera,
exactly,
which is now
1521,
yeah.
And which is in Seville. And each of these elements, you know, which are quite pagan, they go back to early classical time. You know, this figure, the Artemis of Ephesus, you know, which is always thought of as a fertility symbol, but these are probably not breasts, but bull's testicles or gourds. You know, each one you can go into, and then there are the sirens. And
definitely bull's testicles, not gourds.
Well, no, I mean all of these things have been positive. And each thing, and you see this again, this extraordinary transition from pagan to Christianity, and symbols reappearing on the two.
But it's the way ideas mutate and move from one place to another.
I wondered if we might just quickly make the point too. There's one wonderful kind of reversal that runs through the space, where the floors are 18th century chestnut floors. This is a gaming table from 17th century Spain, and all the things that you actually engage with and physically walk on or sit on or work with are original, while everything that surrounds you is in fact a rematerialization from.
So in the second room, we wanted to throw you into Seville. Seville at the beginning of the 16th century in Casa de Pilatos. And autobiographically, I remember going to Casa de Pilatos in the early 1980s and being absolutely amazed. I was working as a painter at that time, but absolutely amazed by the complexity, the material complexity, the aesthetic complexity, and the spatial complexity of the tiles. More recently, it was explained to me by Juan Manuel Albendea, who runs the Casa Ducal de Medina Celi that look after Casa de Pilatos, that these are kind of the summer equivalents of tapestries that would decorate the lower rooms. And I think the fluidity of the glaze with the sound of water and the coolness coming from the gardens is a very important part of them. But
and I think too, it's just, I mean, there's something that's very startling about, because of the nature of glaze and ceramics, these haven't faded at all since they were first made. So you're seeing this sort of timeless object with a, in the case of these tiles, with an aesthetic that's like a Howard Hodgkin painting. And these that look like axonometrics, you know, from the early 20th century. You know, they're surprisingly modern. Don't you find that?
I think it's also the way they're made. So some of the tiles are made by a process called queda, where pieces of string create geometric patterns, and pieces of string create geometric patterns that burn out in the glaze. But as the craftsmen started playing with it, they started introducing a process that's known as Cuenca tile making, where engraved lines were put into the surface of a wood or a metal or a plaster block. The clay is pressed into the block, giving you raised lines. The material is then biscuit fired, and into the biscuit fired material, into these shallow relief, you pour the glaze so it flows while it's being made. And I think it is this craftsmanship that's coming out of materials are put into heat and transform, where Islamic craftsmen are really pushing what you can do in terms of the transformation that happens. And what amazes me is the scale of tile production in Triana and Seville at that time. I mean, in the order for Casa Pilatos, the delivery was around 2,000 tiles a week, and the whole of the ground floor of Casa Pilatos and the staircase is covered floor to ceiling, just like this room. And while we're here, I think it's worth saying the floor is also a replica of the floor in Casa Pilatos. And the ceiling is not a replica of anything. It's a reinterpretation that shows. I think you should do.
Well, no, it's interesting because here you see, you know, where we had to work around and incorporate the elements of the existing structure. It's a grade 2 listed building, and so we couldn't touch anything that was here, and we had to somehow subsume it in what we were bringing in. So we have an original truss and a factum facsimile of the truss. So it becomes sort of mirrors within mirrors. It's quite a funny.
Well, as with everything, it's a game of how you transform spaces and materials into something else. And this room, when we first put it up, all I want now is to introduce a small fountain with the sound of trickling water and some daylight colored bulbs in the lights. So somehow in this top floor of a bank space in Bishop Auckland, you get that magical sense of what happens, or when you're in a cool garden in Casa Pilatos in Seville.
But these heraldic shields are really the only sort of element that set it in a period of time.
And in the catalogue, we've included an image of a tapestry, which is remarkably similar in design to this, with a heraldic shield, with a border, with other details going on in the borders. And I think this space really has transformed. So coming in from row 1 into the tiles, you're then led into what personally I've always wanted to do for years. What I've always wanted to do for years, which is as if it was a kind of lapidarian, to bring a collection of yesteryear, a carved chest that obviously predate. I mean, they predate the Moorish occupation within Spain, but in Spain somehow they became one of the things that, to me, you know, when I went to the Alcazar or to the Alhambra, that define the aesthetics of the space. So
define the aesthetics, but also, you know, here the overlapping of those different cultures is so completely clear, where you have panels with Hebrew, where you have the praising in this one.
No, but I mean, I think the very beginning. So this is an Islamic panel from the 12th or perhaps early 13th century in Toledo, that's now in the convent of the Santa Claras, but it was in the house of an Islamic scholar. And we've replicated them exactly as they are, but with this one doesn't have color. Some of them do have some color, but we didn't try and include the color. So from a purely Islamic pattern making to a purely Jewish pattern making. So the two tall pieces either side of this one come out of the Sinagogo del Transito in Toledo. So these actually are from the same time and from the same locality. Also Toledo panels from Casa de Mesa, which is one of the great Mozart decorations.
So
and where suddenly we've got sort of Renaissance symbolism. This is 15th century running over the top of pattern making. Yeah. And then from the palace of Pedro I from the Alcazar in Seville, we have this panel and the one down here. And I think for me, this panel embodies a lot of the complexities that are Seville, and that you have in this Arabic script praise to Pedro I, who was the king who effectively reoccupied the Alcazar, the great Moorish palace, but was also a friend of the Caliph in Granada. So you have this odd dynamism going on. And I think throughout the show, while the convivencia may not have been as absolutely peaceful as some people wanted to believe, or want to believe, it was a time of remarkable unification. And
I think that's absolutely true. And these panels go into, it's an even greater illustration of that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the ceiling here, because I think this is one of the most remarkable things that really we discover working through a project like this. So when you first look at these ceilings, there's an astonishing complexity that only begins to unfold the deeper you go in. So through the process of replication, there's the depth of understanding that's needed, and the simplicity and the elegance of that geometric exercise.
Well, this is made with just 3 set squares. So one of the text panels that you can find on the website, on Factum's website, or in the publication for the description of each room here, demonstrates how you do this. And there's something amazing. And as we leave this room and head into another bit of Toledo, I'd like to, because the columns should be longer, is actually a 19th century edition, well, maybe early 18th century, late 18th century, but early 19th century edition, to Casa de Pilatos, when they were orientalizing in the late 18th and early 19th century, the decorative elements within Casa de Pilatos.
And this floor too, this is a ceramic floor, a new ceramic floor that was made by ceramicists in Seville. And it is...
It's made to match the color, the size, and the irregularity of the tiles in the Chapel of the Flagellation in Casa de Pilatos. So staying in Toledo, but with a very, very different atmosphere. We formed, I mentioned earlier, a collaboration with Casa del Caldo Medina Celi. And really our collaboration with them and with L'Hopital de la Caridad in Sevilla were the two that I think went furthest in terms of redefining sharing. So for the Casa Ducale Medina Theli, we've actually recorded a number of paintings that are there. We've recorded the whole of Casa de Pilatos in 3 dimensions. We've recorded a lot of the spaces in the L'Hôpital de Carmel Tavera. And we worked at length. So originally this object was not part of the brief, but it became so clear to us that the tabernacle, which is now in a side chapel, is standing on its own without the top section. I'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about the impact of the Spanish Civil War. But when I was first working with Factum, going to the Prado and watching the small figure, the polychrome figure of the resurrecting Christ being restored by the restoration department in the Prado, and not knowing anything about it. And then years later, spending time and thinking and looking. And I mean, polychrome sculpture, realism.
I think that there's something, you know, the difference in painting onto a 3-dimensional form is really worth pointing out. And there's this incredible skill, whether carving the wood, covering the wood in gesso, then adding layer upon layer to create this pale blue veins covered in glazes and glass eyes and glass tears, so that you've got a sort of hyper reality where these figures were carried through the streets as sort of celestial celebrities. You know,
Once we found the image of the tabernacle before it was destroyed, what became very clear is during the restoration, there is a fixing at the top of Christ's head. And as you start to see the proportions, he would have been inside the sepulchre. He would have risen up. And I can do it a little bit. I mean, I can make him move, or maybe I can't, it's locked at the moment. But actually, we will be demonstrating. So he resurrects, he comes out of his sepulchre, he goes up, and he eventually appears in the top space. And I think the idea of this notion of realism and this notion of theatre and taking this object through the streets. So it was at this point that we decided we had to bring in some film with the Filmoteca in Andalusia of historical footage of Semana Santa.
but not that old. I mean, it looks as though it could be hundreds of years old, and it was filmed in
1961. And no, the faces and the characters and the serenity and the feeling. Now, Semana Santa has slightly more of a find images like these of important polychrome sculptures being paraded.
But I think one of the things that's very striking is the fact that we got in the tabernacle the physical enactment of going from mundane to the spiritual. So you're shifting from the earthly to the godly.
And when we're doing this, there are times when I start to forget these objects which have the qualities of the originals are facsimiles. I know I've watched every decision being made, but for me the excitement of scanning El Greco's baptism, I say El Greco's baptism, it was the last great commission to do the decoration for the chapel that El Greco was working on. And the John the Baptist figure we know was painted by, or the experts believe was painted by El Greco. The figure of the angel is probably more by his son, Joaquin Manuel. And then there's the question about which bits people painted, who did what. And in this wonderful tender moment, when they were removing the frame for it to be restored, there are these brush marks, casual, thoughtless brush marks, where the painter is just cleaning their brush off on the side
It's
the
not going to
painting
be visible.
that would be covered by the frame. And I keep looking at this, and when you're close up, the freedom of paint is so staggering, so surprising. The relationship between a fleeting temporal world that's constantly slipping in and out of focus and some more divine notion of unified space collide.
But I think it's also, I mean, one of the fascinating things that comes out of this too is when you talk about the different authors and the different brush marks, you know, the sorts of data that you're collecting and how you're using them.
Well, what happens as a result of this? So there are 3 paintings. There's this one, which is there in the hospital still, and Juan Manuel Albendea said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get the facsimiles of the other back into the chapel? And so we worked with Banco Santander, who were very positive and allowed us to scan the Annunciation of their collection. We're now negotiating with the National Gallery in Athens to record a top section. And we're talking, sadly, I think COVID may delay it a bit, to the Metropolitan Museum in New York to record their panel. And once we've done this, there is a major research project that's grown up where we're using the high frequency three-dimensional data, so very subtle information on the of the brush marks, which are not really the way we look or think of what they're describing. But we're starting to see if with machine learning, we can actually identify different patterns that will reveal El Greco's hand, his son's hand, his other people in the team, and the restorers who've worked on it.
Which is going to have a very interesting impact. Yeah,
well, we think it's going to be one of those things where there's a new digital consortium emerging, and it's a question that we would really love. Let's go by the sarcophagus. But we'd really love to become a major discussion over the coming years. So, what is it that you see when you're looking at an object? Can the data we're recording now, just like X-rays and infrared photography did in the past, can these things reveal things about a painting that take us beyond philology, where the evidence, the material evidence of an object allows us to understand it as a complex subject, and where we can talk about it and engage with it in different ways. But really, with the sepulchre of Cardinal Tavera by Alonso Berruguete is one of those objects that I remember first looking at and not really seeing its importance. It's an amazing white marble sepulchre.
and you have all the symbols again, the classical to you know, and the way in which they shift from pagan to Christian meaning, the griffins and the centaurs and the sirens, and you can see every single detail. You know,
well, the scanning here, so what you're looking at really is state of the art of what it's possible to do without touching an object. So this is all done with various methods of three-dimensional scanning, and then various output technologies. So another theme for me is the digital always used to be associated with the virtual, and now everyone thinks about screen. What we want to start talking about is enriching technologies and in ways that technologies can enrich understanding. And for me, having the privilege of working with this and suddenly finding Buñuel used it in Tristana in a film with Catherine Deneuve, and he describes the face of Cardinal Tavera as being the face of death. And you look at this face, what I can say is there are pictures from the Spanish Civil War where the nose is all smashed and the face is damaged. So it's a restored face of death.
yeah.
But we know Berruguete was working from the death mask of Cardinal Tavera.
I think this is so extraordinary, the idea of painting from death rather than painting from life. And it seems like such a sort of Spanish phenomenon somehow.
Well, I mean, I think seeing this object in the L'Hôpital de Cardinal-Tavera near the tomb, near the sepulchre, and trying to imagine whether this painting, which is normally attributed to Berruguetti, is really by him. I mean, the figure and the body is remarkably weak, but the face has a kind of haunting look, as if someone's probing around to understand these extraordinary cheekbones.
Yeah.
But it was when we started looking at El Greco's portrait of Cardinal Tavera, that's painted about 50 years after Tavera's death, which you can still see in the facsimile. He was literally decapitated and the picture was hacked into
You can
pieces.
see, yes, all these scars. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, but the hacking out is visible on this surface.
And every brush mark is there. And you can find all the rest restored areas where bits are missing. But I think looking at this painting and thinking about Francis Bacon and thinking about Bacon painting from the life mask of William Blake and almost painting to try and obliterate the physicality of the presence, and wondering how Velázquez and Bacon might have talked.
Yeah.
So Velázquez, the great master who can bring things with a touch to life, thinking about Jonathan painting its and thinking about the multiple copies of Innocent X that Bacon said he did because it's just one of the greatest paintings ever done.
But then it's also the way that you can have this extraordinary dialogue between objects that would never normally be together, that couldn't be together. They can't travel, they can't move, you can't take a room of tiles and shift them to somehow.
So in Toledo, some of these objects exist together, but getting them here to be seen alongside the rest of the pictures in the Spanish gallery, and to try and also introduce the subject. The recording things is essential to their preservation. So on the side wall, we have 3 of the virtues from the corner of the sepulchre that were made at the beginning of the 20th century as plaster casts, before the damage that was done during the Spanish Civil War. And really focusing on the dream and the vision of Henry Cole and the Victoria and Albert Museum of making things public through plaster casts, sharing again this whole for people who couldn't travel.
And now in COVID, people can't travel. But they were very damaged. I mean,
the plaster casts did some damage, but they at least recorded everything that was lost. Plaster casts on Polychrome are much more damaging. And the plaster casts here, obviously, when we're doing the recording, we never touch at all.
Yeah.
But the technology, as the caption says, the
But
technology.
I was always fascinated by the idea that you have this snapshot in time. So you have things, objects that are in the view, that are in much better sort of shape than the original objects.
Through in the
that are
cascades.
destroyed.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and here, I mean, just because it seemed a very important thing to show you the figure of Christ we were looking at by El Greco, the El Greco painting with the fragments that were cut to pieces, the extraordinary sculpture by Michelangelo that Berruguetti brought back, the little John the Baptist, and the sepulchre of Cardinal Tavera that was very badly damaged. The sepulchre of Cardinal Tavera was the model that was used for, the sepulchre of Cardinal Cisneros was the model that was used for the sepulchre of Cardinal Tavera. So I think this room introduces the Renaissance, that moment, and Berruguetti for me is one of the sculptors who I've learned most from while doing this work. I mean, he's an extraordinary artist, a close friend of Michelangelo, and someone who was, as Charlotte mentioned earlier, studying the classics, studying antiquity, who knew what was the complexity of objects that in a way that the Warburg Institute later turned into an art form of building narratives around the pagan myths of the Renaissance. And in the last room, I don't want to start by talking about the myths or the pagan aspect of it, but the great paintings by Juan de Valdés that hang in the hospital of the Caridad in Seville, which was a hospital.
Well, it was an amazing thing because it was originally created around death. So it was a place where the bodies, many of them thrown by the river, were given a Christian burial. So it was only when Manuel arrived and shifted the focus onto the living.
Manuel Manera, who really was a repentant sinner, almost a kind of fundamentalist figure who found God and gave up his ways, focused the work of the brothers in the Santa in the Lopta de la Caridad
on the living, creating a hospital for the ill, but also a place for them to live, a place for them to eat. And then develop this extraordinary narrative through the commission of great paintings.
So
that was sort of arranged in space in a very strong. So that's the idea of these paintings. Where you walk in and under the narthex, under the ceiling, you see in the space, you're looking at these two unbelievably powerful vanitas paintings.
And it should be remembered that just before these were painted, I mean, the title of the display that Charles and I and all the team from Factum have put together here is In It to Oculi, which we translate as In the Blink of an Eye.
What John Donne translates as In Twinkling of an Eye. And it's this brief moment that's life, and you have this sinister, the hollow eye sockets of death staring at you.
I mean, this painting is an amazing vanitas with Rubens's. It's Rubens.
It's Rubens. It's a triumphal arch that was painted in honor of the Spanish dignitary who, I mean, it was to symbolize sort of political corruptness, I think.
I mean, the narrative that we want to work on now, and for me, every project leads into second and third layers. But looking particularly at this painting, and again, I should repeat, I mean, in the hospital where again I first saw them in the early 80s, when figurative painting was just coming back in, when the School of London painters who I was sort of associated with were reintroducing figuration. And I remember seeing these, but you couldn't really see them as we see them here. So the dream was always to say, while they're amazing as part of a decorative cycle in Seville, wouldn't it be wonderful if they could also come down so we can contemplate them up close and look at the spatial qualities?
This is so extraordinary.
The maggots crawling out of the eyeball and the insects that we identify as scarabs rather than cockroaches. And then the hand holding the scales. I mean, the paintings are called hieroglyphs of the afterlife. And I love to think that the knowledge from Egypt that came via the Greeks up through Alexandria, up into Toledo, where the translations were being done, where there was a whole esoteric awareness that the barrier between life and death was not so simple.
And each of the symbols changes their meaning. I mean, it's so fluid, it's extraordinary.
Well, here where the peacock feather is a sign of vanity, but also in pharaonic culture, it's a soul that's weighed against, on a balance, against a feather. And if your soul is heavier than a feather, you're doomed to oblivion. And the owl here playing many roles, but one is as the bar soul who flies and carries your memory beyond. And I think these two pictures, now they're here, hopefully people from the Zurbarán Center, from the University of Durham, and many others will engage with them, will learn from them.
But I remember it was so extraordinary, even before the lights were put on. There was a day in the gallery here when the came on, and suddenly all the depth of this painting was visible. And I just, I think I mean, and it's also worth saying that these paintings have never left the location for which they were originally intended, and where they were originally intended was so symbolically important within that building, within that journey. But the idea that Factum is now making more of this, I mean,
well, we're making another set for the Hospital de la Caridad. So we're building a visitor centre there. And which I'd love to talk about, so I hope in the Q&As that we're going to touch on, we can talk about all of the repercussions of the work we've done here. But I'd like to finish by just pointing up to the ceiling and saying, making this extraordinary carved plaster ceiling from three-dimensional data and watching the milling machines whirring away for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and then watching them find their form here. And the only bit that we've added is the text, Spanish typography. So really, we want everyone to come out saying tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And I think what we've tried to do here is to set something up which can sow the seeds of fire, whether you're interested in technology, whether you're interested in art, whether you're interested in Spain, whether you're just a visitor, but that you can find something here to really engage with, and that art is the ability, if you like, to see the complexity of the world through the eyes of others, and the objects are the portals that lead you in. So let's sit down and talk.
That's my cue, I think. Thank you, Adam and Charlotte, for that fascinating tour de force of the new display, which was, I mean, I had seen something beforehand, but I had no idea quite how extraordinary it actually was. And to have a tour through by yourself was quite an extraordinary treat. And understandably, the questions are coming in thick and fast. And quite ironically, the first one actually concerns ceilings. And it's from Miriam Rosser-Owen, who says, thank you for this behind-the-scene tours of the new gallery. Could you say more about how and where the ceilings were made? Are they based on particular ceilings in Spanish buildings?
Well, I think I can probably take the lead on answering that, Miriam. So the ceiling in the room with the gessos is a ceiling from a specific room in Casa de Mesa, and is a very specific pattern. With specific paint made as a facsimile. The other two ceilings that are elaborate ceilings in a sort of mudéjar style are really improvisations where Charlotte has worked with the language of patterning different types of
yeah, so it was very much the sort of research into how those patterns were developed, and it came out with an extraordinary team. In fact, you know, playing with those geometries and referencing the actual methodology they originally used. But I think it's important to say that what we were trying to do again is to show the three converging Abrahamic influences. So this one, as you just saw, it's very much a Christian iconography, whereas the others are, you know, this sort of blurred moment where the three different
Well, I think where there's an absolute celebration of pattern making. I mean, the ceiling that is a facsimile, for me, it will probably be restored in the coming years because Jose Luis Colomer is proposing to do a lot of work on Casa de Mesa, which is an extraordinary building, covering many, many years. at a critical moment in life in Toledo. And I'll be fascinated to see how that ceiling changes as it's cleaned, as it's restored, as the pattern is found.
Well, the level of detail in some of these things is extraordinary. The painting, which was, of course, all exactly reproduced through recording and then printing new layers of gesso. So.
I mean, and actually just having the opportunity to spend time in Casa de Mesa. Now it's in pretty poor condition, a lot of it, but still the yesterday breathtaking. And that's, you know, in Charlotte and I, the end fights that we have, because, you know, when you're doing a museum space, you constantly have to put sensors and fire detectors and smoke detectors and everything else. And somehow here we've just about managed to keep all of the speakers and the modern things required within a museum. Slightly.
The next question is also slightly practical. And I suppose it's about your own work, and I suppose it refers to the sepulchre specifically, but it could be applied to much else. How long did it take to create the sepulchre?
It's always slightly hard to answer because we accelerate work and slow it down depending on the work that's going on in the studio. But what I can say is that we had in Seville, when the plans were laid for what we were going to do. That breakfast was followed, I should think, in June of 2019 by a team of 2 people from Factum spending a week recording the sepulchre using high resolution photogrammetry and LiDAR scanning. They then came back to Madrid and we processed the data. And then we sent the team back again to capture bits we didn't feel were good enough or where the data was too noisy. And then over a period of about 5 months, we were 3D printing, CNC milling, and bringing back the sepulchre as a physical object, but in a totally different material.
I mean, it is amazing when you think we walking through the studios often take photographs or short films or whatever, the various different stages, and the strange photographs, some of which are in the catalogue, you know, of the face inside out. You know, we really are inhabiting these artworks.
It's looking into the mold of the face of Catling. And actually, Charlotte's right. I mean, one of the things we've also done here is there are a lot of QR codes on the wall. So now QR codes have become familiar and easy to use through COVID. We've got 7 QR codes with the making of. So you can actually watch a video of the making of the sepulchre as you're walking.
And I think it's also, you know, I think a lot of young people, a lot of people who are working with their computers all the time, playing games with their computers, are going to see that actually the data that's recorded, you know, what they're using in the worlds that they're inhabiting are actually merging. So,
well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, so computer games are a little bit like Hollywood movies, where they rely on 3D scanning, they rely on very sophisticated software like Unreal Engine to create real-time illusions that you move through that are closing the gap between a representation and a sense of reality that you start to believe, where the shadows and the light are responding dynamically.
I mean, architecture is the same. You know, it uses the same tools, the same data, the same software to simulate environments and to move through them and to capture it. So all of these worlds are merging, and it's fascinating. So they don't have to be just a sort of form of escapism. There's a form of a kind of deep knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and also computer games tend to now play a lot of historical narratives, but also to go quite deep. So there's a lot of people who get their historical knowledge out of computer games. And what we would love here is the young generation of people from Bishop Auckland to come in and be amazed by the fact that you don't have to negotiate everything through a screen. Actually, here you have rematerializations of the kind of data that's normally shown on screen. So yes, we can take the data we recorded in the Hospital of Cardinal Tavera or in Casa de Mesa, and we can create a virtual environment. Or you can come here where everything is about giving you a physical engagement which can lead you back in front of the original object. I mean, the first job, I suppose, well, very quickly, the answer to the question is about a year. So it took about a year to make it. We could have probably done it in 6 months. But the very first job that really Factum did that transformed how we were looking at objects and paintings and architecture was the facsimile of the Veronese's wedding at Skene that was painted specifically for the refectory designed by Palladio on San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. And the original was taken by Napoleon to, is now in the Louvre. But to actually see the painting back in its original setting.
But there you had such a close kind of alliance between the space and the painting itself, where the painting really was space all the other way around.
That's right. And you know, in a way, what we've done here is the other way around.
Yeah.
Here we brought the two paintings by Valdez Leal that have never moved and hopefully never will, from the hospital in L'Hôpital de la Caridad, and brought them to Bishop Auckland, where you can sit on real 17th century benches and engage with these two paintings. And I think for me, that's something I hope will trigger in many people a desire to know more about what the paintings mean, more about how these facsimiles were made, and more about all the other paintings that occupy this building.
I do hope and feel somehow that people leaving this space and going back down through the museum will see it in a slightly different way. I think there's that possibility.
The next question, I think you answered already. The furniture you're sitting on and the table you showed us, they are actual pieces of art. They are actually not your own creations.
That's absolutely right.
It's a total reversal.
And what I'd say is, of course, like all actual pieces of art, they're also not quite what they seem. So, for example, the bench we're sitting on has totally original 17th century legs and metalwork. And the wood, in all probability, is 17th century too, but it is actually a door. So if you look on the outside, you can see a door has been reused as a bench. The other bench, which is far better in quality, is a bench from 1620 with brass plaques with the date on. But the legs are later additions, probably 19th or early 20th century. So the preservation and the maintenance of things in good condition, and the little gaming table Charlotte pointed to at the beginning, we talked to quite a lot of experts because there was some sense that it could be Italian. It could have come from Naples, but I think the general consensus by the end of the discussions is the carving is absolutely Spanish and not Italian. And it is this deep engagement, this connoisseurly engagement with questioning, with looking and with thinking that I hope that we partially trigger. I mean, personally, I get pleasure from very strange things. And as I walk around looking at the floors here, which are facsimiles of terracotta floors, that I really think we've come up with a process that's nailed it. But also,
they're in old chestnut ones in the first place. I mean, there is this wonderful sort of fluid.
But every time you do something, you want to go further. So the terracotta tiles if I do it again, we have to back them with concrete, which yes, will make them more heavy to transport, will probably make them a little bit less eco, but will make them feel more terracotta when you walk on them.
That's amazing. The next question, I'm not sure I fully understand, but you may well do. Why do you choose to reproduce the ceilings by CNC rather than traditional methods?
Oh, because I understand that question fully. The answer is, what we're not trying to do is to recreate a design to show traditional craft skills that we don't necessarily have. So very often we would work with traditional plaster workers in this case to try and rematerialize a design. But what became very important for me on these ceilings is their specificity. There are things here that I didn't want just to allude to by saying this is a remaking of that design. I mean, we do that from time to time. So right now we've got a beautiful project making silverware by Giulio Romano from his designs. And there we will in part be working with craftsmen because we're trying to reinvent a design that we don't have an object for. But here we have an object, and I wanted the specificity of that ceiling in the Narthex, in Seville, to be exactly that ceiling, not an approximation of it.
But and then there are moments, gilding and so on, which is all done by hand. So you do have that wonderful kind of combination of technology and the digital.
Well, that's right. I mean, usually I describe factum arte as building bridges between new technologies and traditional craft skills. So that's very much a goal. Factum Foundation's role is to focus on the relationship between an original object and what gives it its authentic presence, and how, by understanding the specific qualities of that object, how it's aged, how it's been looked after, where it's been, who's restored it, that you come to a deeper understanding of what it really is. And in this case, the ceiling in this room and the facsimile of the ceiling from Casa de Mesa, it's very important they are exactly like they were. The
So
ceiling,
just the process of making, you have to look so carefully in order to understand these things, in order to reconstruct them. I mean, it's an amazing process.
well, it is sort of blurring so many boundaries. But I think for me, it is the materiality of objects that allows us to read not only the material transformations when they're made, but the material transformations that happen over time, and the human interventions to try and arrest those actions, those transformations. And I think it's thinking of originality as a dynamic process, which I know it is every time I look in the mirror, especially when I've drunk too much or I'm overtired. And you know that the face is still mine, but it's not as I looked when I was 20.
I think we all feel that. A question from once I finish laughing, a question from Ascardiel. Thank you very much for this privileged tour. And I mean, there have been a number of these messages which I've not really been reading out, but there are many of those. Could you go into depth about the paintings related to Catling de Ribera?
They're actually carvings on the sepulchre of Catalina de Ribera. We included them here because of the relationship with the first Duke of Alcalá and Casa de Pilatos. I'd rather answer that question in depth later, but they are completely extraordinary. Some of the finest marble carvings I've seen, and they actually stemmed out of the breakfast meeting.
The first row is really sort of an extraordinary. It's quite a playful room, you know, where there are lots of games being played and lots of layers and illusions and quotations being made. I mean, that's the sort of exception.
And there's also, I mean, again, I mean, I don't know how many people will be coming to the Spanish Gallery. I mean, I hope everyone listening will come and enjoy the whole space. But we're also imagining that there'll be times when the local people can come here. And, you know, Charlotte and I have already had one rather magical evening in Witherspoons discussing the merits.
Whoever would have thought those two words could go.
Yeah, discussing the merits of Stubbs, Gainsborough and Constable with one of the security guards here and three of his friends who'd actually been to see a collection of pictures of Stubbs and Gainsborough that Jonathan Ruffer had in the Bishop's Palace.
Yeah.
And I think it's this engagement, it's having pictures of this quality here that hopefully will act as a magnet and will be part of the regeneration of Bishop Auckland, but also will act as a privileged point of access for people in the town of Bishop Auckland, where they can come. And so in the first room, you might have seen it in the background, but there is a library where you can come and sit at the card table.
The idea is very much that people, and also just, there's so many layers, and a lot of the layers are there present in the pictures, but then as Adam explained, you can go through the sort of portals of the QR codes, you can go into the books, into the catalogues, into the texts that have been written. But that room is we're trying to make a place for people to stop and sit and look and absorb. And that's a room that we really hope will be used as a place for people to sit and read and become sort of, you know, conversos, the converted to Spain.
Yes. And really, we want people to think of digital technologies, new technologies, the world we inhabit now, as not necessarily being impoverishing. That there are enriching aspects to the technologies we have at our fingertips now. And if the younger generation in Bishop Auckland sees the opportunity and get excited by it, I really feel the top floor here can gradually filter down and inform all the original paintings that you have to engage with very differently below, and then will spread out. And, you know, I love the fact that in Barnard Castle, in the Bowes Museum, there are great Spanish paintings. I love the fact that the Rugby Venus used to be quite close to here in Rugby Hall.
Yeah, there's a whole tradition in the north of England. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, seeing the Zurbarán paintings in that dining room and wondering what those people must have thought, surrounded by these kind of extraordinary silks and, you know, stamped leathers and exotic turbans. I mean, it's thrilling, the weird meeting of these different worlds happening here.
I think we could be, I mean, I've rarely been to a session where the questions have sparkled so much. Unfortunately, I think we've only got time for one more, but it seems an appropriate point to end on, and it's from Kathleen McCarthy. Thank you so much indeed. I would love to hear more about the nature of the collaboration with your Spanish counterparts, museum curators, etc. Is there general support among the custodians of the original art for digital reproduction of this, open brackets, amazing and inspiring, close brackets, kind? And have you encountered much resistance?
Obviously, I'm a profound diplomat when it comes to answering that question. What I would say is 20 years ago, when I started doing what I did, we would often encounter profound resistance, where the normal thing is people suddenly saying, oh, no, you know, if there's 2 copies of this painting, it'll somehow lessen the original. Of course, we all know that the more things are copied, like the Mona Lisa, the more they enter the public imagination, the more you look and the more you have a chance to see. So the more important the original becomes. And if things aren't copied, they tend to fade away. What I would say here is I do believe we've set up a series of collaborative relationships with the custodians of these objects, in which Bishop Auckland benefits, the custodians benefit, and often more than just in a sort of a theirs or ours way. So it's much more than is this mine or yours. It's gone beyond that. So I mentioned what we're doing for the Hospital of Hospital de la Caridad in Seville. We're actually building for them a visitor center where the two Murillo paintings and the two Valdez Leal paintings will be shown like they are here, in a room parallel to the chapel, and where you'll be able to study them carefully. We're also going to show them with and without colour. So we're going to show them just as a surface and as a finished surface with paint, with what looks like paint.
I mean, I think it might be worth mentioning too how much original sort of new knowledge is discovered through the digital recordings. Whether it's the Tomb of Tutankhamun and the door, or it's the pouncing marks on the cartoons, Raphael's cartoons, or it's yeah, I mean, it's opening up astonishing new scholarship. Yeah. I mean, this is.
So actually, whereas the traditional scholars often used to slightly resist, now they're becoming our first line of support. So I think people are realizing, and actually, strangely, this may be a very good way to wind up. But COVID, I think, made people, particularly museums, reflect on the way objects could be communicated offline, so when you visit, but also online, so what you can do, how you can get access, how you can see things. And
they also realized how little material they had. Having talked about online experiences, suddenly what that meant became very clear.
So we're looking forward to a new renaissance of art history, where we can reveal a whole new level of information, which opens new fields for deep study, which will of course connect to the past. So the bridge is built, and I hope everyone will come and enjoy it.
Well, all that remains for me to say is a quite extraordinary thank you for giving us such a tour de force, both of your own thoughts and of your own creations. And for those of us who are lucky enough to be there tomorrow, it will, I'm sure, be an extraordinary experience. And I mean, I'm sure we can't give you a round of applause in the virtual format, but I'm sure, I hope you imagine you will be receiving one, albeit virtually. And it only remains, I should just say, finally, if you've enjoyed this week, please come back next week for Lissandra Estevez's talk on Ribera. And bear in mind Ignacio's, but it just remains really to say an enormous thank you to Charlotte and to Adam for giving us such an inspirational evening. I believe that, I think particularly now art history does need a renaissance, and I think we may just be seeing the way forward for it. So thank you very much indeed. I shall look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.